Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, bringing you the latest news from Taiwan. I'm Gladys Lee.
I'm Rath Wang. In addition to the Wall Street Journal, unnamed White House officials revealed that Cuba has agreed to let China build a spy facility on its soil. This could allow Beijing to eavesdrop on and even monitor key communications and sea lanes just 160 kilometers away from the U.S. mainland.
And today in the studio, we have two experts. We are introducing you Stephen Tan, Managing Director of the International Policy Advisory Group, and Charles Wu, he's the professor to the Department of Diplomacy at National Chengchi University. A warm welcome back to both of you.
We've seen tensions between the U.S. and China continue to escalate, from this Chinese spy balloon flying over continental U.S. airspace to reports of China's new plans to set up eavesdropping facilities in Cuba. Stephen, has de-escalation come to the point of no return?
Well, I think both sides, both the United States and China, are trying as we speak, resuming the dialogue, building up the guardrails and to avoid miscommunications. And I think this is critically important. And I think although you've seen the news hitting around the world of the escalating nature between the two countries, I do believe that going forward, it will have some signals of better ways of communications and de-escalated in a way that it remains a strategically competitive relationship, but to avoid misunderstanding and try to solve the conflict amicably, and if not, at least to have a better ways and channels of communications. And this has been evidenced by the current visit of Secretary Tony Blinken to Beijing. And we've seen some developments, and we're monitoring the developments. There might be some positive signs, but in any case, it will have a tremendous impact of the relationship between the two biggest countries in the world and the rest of the world.
Stephen talked about miscalculations and avoiding them.
Right.
Charles, what measures, Stephen also mentioned guardrails, do you think the two countries can put in place?
China and United States, they need to build the guardrails.
What are those guardrails?
Resume the conversation, diplomatic ways, because Blinken mentioned about visit China several times, but if they don't solve the basic red line issues, go back to political conversation, they cannot push back other like economic, diplomatic, or even the military conversation.
Do you feel it's moving in that direction at the moment?
At least, probably Blinken will have a potential visit this week. We don't know yet. However, I think not only Blinken, several one like Yellen want to visit, Romendo want to visit. Even if you pay attention to the news last week, when Austin visited Singapore for Shangri-La, he cannot even talk with Li Shangfu. So this is the biggest problem is if the two great powers, they cannot resume back to this kind of diplomatic channels.
You're saying there's no conversation between the two sides.
Is there any possible to escalate to armed conflicts, Stephen?
Well, I hope not. I think I think the situation has been escalated in a way that because of the lack of communications, and because either or both parties are really trying to demonstrate the capabilities in advance of any sensible communications. Then the whole world is seeing some escalating events. But I do believe that, first of all, I don't think the current situation has been escalated to a point where there's no return, and then there is a potential or threat to military confrontation. Right. I think it's still the strategic competition relationship between the two powers, and they're having some differences that is not reconcilable. But on the other hand, there are issues that both sides would be able to find ways to sit down and talk to each other. And I think this is ongoing, and I think both sides, I believe, have compelling and imperative interest in doing so. And this has been encouraged by the rest of the world to see the two powers sitting down and talk with each other.
You talked about unreconcilable differences. Do you feel Taiwan is one of them?
Well, I think Taiwan. What the issue about Taiwan or Taiwan Strait as more of the reassurance where China is seeking certain degree of reassurance from the United States that the U.S. One China policy has not been changed in a substantive way, whereas the United States has been seeking assurance and reassurance from China that the resolution between Taiwan and China has to go through the the peaceful means. That means that you cannot threaten the use of force. You cannot do any form of coercion, including economic coercion, and you cannot unilaterally change the peace and stability of Taiwan Strait without the consent and the best interest of 23 million people in Taiwan. So I think both sides are in the process of seeking assurance and reassurance from the other side. And I don't think that's not reconcilable. I think it's still in the process, although there are some differences that cannot be resolved. But I think having a conversation, having a high-level conversation and communications of various issues, including the issues on Taiwan Strait, are critically important. I think this is ongoing, and I think we are a stakeholder. Taiwan is a critically important stakeholder, and a participant in a way that the interests of Taiwan and the interests of the Taiwan people, are the critical piece of the overall, decision making and the development. And so, in that sense, we're a stakeholder and we're a participant in the development of the current event, including what's going on in the Taiwan Strait.
I want to go back to Cuba and talk about the timing, Charles. As we know, maybe this planned eavesdropping the facility was not new, according to what Biden administration comments. What do you say about it?
Cuba has become the playground of the spy games
between back to 1962, right?
Yeah, between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Crisis, right.
Yeah.
So if we talk about the timing, why now talk about this news leak?
Like I say, during the Cold War times, Soviet Union and the United States, they try to collect information with each other. They're doing this kind of eavesdropping in Cuba, anywhere in the war is very common.
Right.
Right now, Soviet Union collapsed. Russia is handling the Ukraine war. China replaced the positions. They also try to collect information and some the intelligence issue with the United States. So it's very common right now between Chinese people and American intelligence. They collect the information everywhere. Look at Hong Kong. United States put a lot of spies in Hong Kong. South China Sea, United States used the drones and also the Air Force to collect information from China. China also doing the same thing right now. They put the eavesdropping in Cuba. I think American people, they know that. And they are not really that worried comparing with the Balloon Gate. Because Balloon Gate, first thing, they fly over the United States territory. And second thing is the eavesdropping, I think United States already got some basic information about Chinese people's activities in Cuba. This is one thing we need to be very aware.
They even blame it. Actually, it's from the before administration from Trump, right?
Yeah. The second thing is I don't think it's good comparison between the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and this time the eavesdropping, because first thing is 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis is a nuclear deterrence game. It's a chicken game between Soviet Union and the United States. They use this kind of, we call the nuclear deterrence. Also, they talk about, there are actually 3 strategies provided by United States with ACOMs. First is airstrike or comprehensive intervene, or the quarantines. However, in the end, the quarantine factions, they won. This is proposed by Bob Kennedy and also McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. John Kennedy adopted the quarantine and slowed down and sees this potential, what we call the World War III. However, this time, I don't think the Chinese eavesdropping in Cuba can become the next, we call 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
So would
and
you
they're very
say
important.
this may be the linking to the 2024 presidential election, so that they need to have this type of news to talk about in between the two parties in the States?
Let me say there's a conspiracies during the balloon gate and also
Right.
this kind of eardropping issues. Some people mentioned that why this become a big news, especially when
And why
Blinken.
now, right? The timing.
Why Blinken, when Blinken want to resume the talk, and they say, oh, there's a balloon gate, oh, there's eavesdropping. There's one conspiracy say some people don't want Biden administration to what? To build up this kind of connections, or we call engagement with mainland China. They want the United States still adopt the hawkish attitudes or strategy against China, at least to maintain the United States hegemony in the war. So, like I say, when we watch the news, we only see the top of the iceberg. There's a lot of things under the iceberg. Okay, it's very interesting to study international relations.
Sure. So
What do you say to that, Stephen? Do you feel
Yeah.
that this is a move for the U.S. domestic audience, or do you feel that the U.S. is actually substantially trying to do something
Right.
to prevent this?
Well, I think the spy activities and facilities in Cuba has been there, for a while. Even Tony Blinken, just not too long ago, openly recognized that this has been the case, at least since 2019, during the Trump administration. I agree with Charles to the extent that yes, right before Tony Blinken's scheduled visit to Beijing, the Wall Street Journal broke the news,
Right.
followed by some some unanimous tips from the White House officials, and then the Washington Post. I think there are lots of conspiracy theories being built up, but I think at the end of the day, it will do some check and balance on the current Biden administration in terms of the ongoing meetings and discussions, or even to a certain extent the negotiations with the Chinese counterparts. But it will not change the nature of the fact that both powers are in the process of resuming the communications and sitting down to discuss some substantive issues. I think there are some political connotations of holding that back in Washington. But then you can see that Mark Warner of Virginia and also Marco Rubio of Florida, both chair and co-chair of Intelligence Committee of the Senate, particularly Mark Rubio, and he's a Cuban American elected out of Florida, and then I think he has a vested interest in watching out what's going on, in 100 miles away from Florida. And Cuba as being a base, not just military intelligence, but everything. Previously, former Soviet Union, Russia, now China, and this is being in the backyard of the United States.
So you feel it's actually a substantial threat to the U.S.?
Well, I think so. I think so, and not just Cuba, but also other countries in Latin America, and we might talk about that later. But I think this has posed a real threat. But I agree, this is different from the balloon gate. The spy balloon is basically flying over the U.S. territory, but Cuban intelligence facility. And that's another question that's in Cuba, a separate, sovereign state and territory.
When you look at Guantanamo Bay, it's in Cuba as well. You have U.S. military assets in that area. Do you feel that the U.S. could court Cuba back, as we've seen with Obama in his beginning of his term? Do you feel that Biden could do that, or future U.S. presidents could do that, so that they could stave off adversaries such as China?
Well, I think it has been the goal. I recall the Biden administration has openly mentioned the revisit of the current sanctions, economic sanctions mainly, but then I think there is a variety of different twists of the sanctions, and then I think that revisit of the sanctions on Cuba is ongoing. And I think it won't be, but the whole direction would not be changed simply because of the outbreak of the news by Wall Street Journal that there is a spying facilities in Cuba. But then again, I think there's a real threat in the backyards of the United States that China's been building up around, and I think China claims that U.S. has been doing pretty much the same thing in other places, but I think the threat is there, and I think the in Washington folks are trying to gather the momentum. Either in the pre-election season or going forward. I mean that there is a momentum that's been building up about not just the United States strategic competition with China, but certain degree of I think the competition or even antagonism against China, and I think that momentum has been there. And then you see some news events here and there, including what's going on, what we talked about right now, and then this will not be the last.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. And we'll come back to talk more on the spy facility in Cuba. So earlier, Rath spoke to Stephen Nagy. So he's the visiting fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs and Politics and International Studies professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo. And he is also senior fellow at the MacDonald Laurier Institute and fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Let's have a look.
Professor, with the White House confirming that China is building a new spy facility in Cuba, what does this mean for rising US-China tensions?
It's not a surprise, I think, that China would be interested in building a spy station in Cuba. It gives them the opportunity to listen into discussions and in the United States. But I think it's also a tit for tat. The reality is that the United States does have a basis throughout the Indo-Pacific, providing the United States the same kinds of opportunities to listen into what's happening in China. So it's a tit for tat rather than, I think, an escalation. But I don't think it bodes well for bilateral relations. Again, I think this will be seen as not something that the Biden administration cannot push back against, which may cause some more tension in the relationship. As we saw with the balloon saga in late 2022, there was just no way for the Biden administration to not respond, which disrupted the opportunity for conversation and for Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, to visit Beijing to try and create some pathways for cooperation.
What new developments do you expect from?
Well, I think dialogue is always important. What we've seen is a succession of dialogue between Chinese counterparts and American counterparts. For example, Jake Sullivan met his counterpart Wang Yi, and they discussed some substantive issues between the two states. In terms of trying to draw their red lines, provide a clear understanding where they sit in terms of those key issues. And of course, one of the biggest key issues is Taiwan. The United States are consistent that their one China policy has not changed, that they prioritize peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. But Beijing sees this differently. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's discussions with Wang Yi about trying to discuss the core issues in the relationship, and that is Taiwan, to try to talk about technology curbs on the Chinese economy, potentially talk about some areas of cooperation. And here I'm thinking of climate change, perhaps diplomatic cooperation, coordination to try and convince Vladimir Putin to pull out or to withdraw from his invasion of Ukraine. And I do think there's some other areas where the United States and China can potentially build some dialogue. Really, the ball is not in the Washington's court. It's really in Xi Jinping's court. I think that Beijing is feeling very insecure right now. They're feeling surrounded by the United States and its allies. They're feeling the coordinated diplomacy that the Biden administration has provided in the region by strengthening alliance partners, putting forward, I think, very visionary legislation such as the CHIPS Act. And as we saw just last week, an announcement about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And it's this collective, sequential, and systematic approach to diplomacy and pressuring China to change some of its behavior that I think Beijing would like to find ways to de-escalate so it can stabilize its economy.
You spoke about Balloon Gate, and do you feel that this incident could actually blow up into what we saw in Balloon Gate, given that the US elections are coming next year and that US administrations both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, have the urge to appear to be harder on China?
What I'm very relieved about in the United States is that we're seeing prominent op-eds such as Jessica Chen Weiss and others in the New York Times and the Washington Post talking about the need for a more rational, less confrontational, more synergistic diplomatic approach to dealing with China. They keep trying to send the message that China is not a 10-foot giant. Rather, it is a fragile superpower, as Susan Shirk has written in many of her writings, and that a wise politician, an experienced politician, should be able to prevent another balloon gate from occurring in the wake of these spy stations being placed in Cuba, and finding other ways to pressure Beijing or to remove the spy stations. It's really important that we continue to have a cool-headed approach to dealing with China. We don't want to spiral into accidental conflict, and we don't want to create the conditions where nationalism in China creates internal pressures on Xi Jinping and his ruling clique to do something much more provocative across the Taiwan Straits. I think also we should also look at how Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and I think privately in Taiwan as well, are sending signals to Washington and the Biden administration that bluster is not the only way to deal with China. That there's a need to de-escalate relations because of the economic codependencies that exist within the region. And despite the real challenges that exist between China and many of its neighbors, including the United States, that there's also very strong economic relationships that the neighbors of China need to negotiate and balance as they engage in their bilateral and collective relations with China.
Professor, with this continued tit for tat and the intertwined economic relationship between China and countries here in the Asia Pacific, are there any immediate challenges to Japan and Taiwan?
So I think the key priorities that continue to surface in Tokyo and of course Taipei is what is the direction of Beijing's policies towards Taiwan? Is it interested in a forced reunification? Is it willing to use gray zone tactics or operations and lawfare to achieve its national objectives? And I think cool-headed analysts seem to think that Beijing does prefer a peaceful reunification, and I know the expression in Taiwan is unification, that they're willing to wait. The problem is what we've seen in terms of behavior in the region, that in some ways Beijing has become more belligerent. The military exercises around Taiwan in August last year, the rhetoric about not reserving the right to use force, and even the recent defense minister's speech in the Shangri-La dialogue following Lloyd Austin's speech really sent the strongest of signals that Beijing is willing to use force. It sees the United States as being an alien country to the region, and China continues to send a signal that the region is its backyard. And for Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asian countries, they live in this region. The region is their backyard as well. And they are very concerned about Beijing's assertive behavior within the region. And they would like the United States to have a strong, anchored diplomatic, security, and economic presence within the region to ensure that peace and stability across the Taiwan states remains intact, that the status quo remains intact, and that the region's economic integration continues to proceed in a stable, rules-based, transparent, and prosperous way. And frankly, Beijing's actions are not bringing confidence to any of the players I just mentioned.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken mentioned that U.S. diplomacy has slowed China's expansionism and espionage activities. Charles, given that this new spy facility is actually on the doorsteps of the U.S., how successful has U.S. diplomacy actually been?
We can say right now, United States and China, they are going back to we call diplomatic battles. Before,
But does the U.S. have the upper hand, you feel?
like I say, there's different kind of arguments. Some people say Xi Jinping just sit down tightly waiting for the United States coming to talk. However, some people mention that it's not only Xi Jinping's responsibility, but it's also Blinken's or United States' responsibility to resume back the conversation between two great powers. Because we know that if two great powers never want to go back to the conversations, it's very dangerous for we call the kind of potential military conflicts. When we study international conflicts or militarized conflicts, it always starting from we call the misunderstanding or misinformation or even miscommitments. There's some paper argue that the war will occur because it's misinformation problems. Both sides try to provide fake news, fake information, or let people assume they will not attack. However, they have already a willingness and opportunity to attack.
And you feel that has increased recently.
If you don't talk, if you don't resume the conversation, this kind of misunderstanding, or we call gas, will increasing between two great powers.
There's also news in Taiwan recently that many say sources might be from China that the U.S. is planning to retreat its people, its expats. Would you see that as an example?
Yeah, we heard this kind of news come and goes, and people always say whether the United States is restoring their the people, or other countries like Philippines, Indonesia, they are restoring the people. Actually, I don't know, because we don't have this kind of information, or actually probably they are fake news. But we always know that any countries, they have this kind of plan B or even plan C when the war occurs. They will always know what they want to do.
Or even in terms of peace, with natural disasters, earthquakes.
Yeah, for sure.
These contingency plans.
Yeah, for sure. But if we pay attention to news currently, I think Kirby also mentioned that it's very common, but they don't have any kind of this kind of evacuation plan right now.
For Taiwan.
For Taiwan, especially for American people in Taiwan. So we need to know that first, this region still remain we call status quo. Both United States and China, they want at least stability in this region. Second, not only United States and China, I think both Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, South Asian countries, they also want a stable East Asia. Okay, so I don't think anyone want to open the Pandora box. If anyone dare to open the Pandora box, let people go into the realist way, which call the nature of human beings, I don't think this will be good for everyone.
Stephen, aside from the lack of communication between the U.S. and China, do you feel that the U.S. has had success in the region in terms of rallying allies that you've seen in Japan, South Korea, other countries?
I think so. I think that's one of the most successful diplomacy for the past 2.5 years in the Biden administration in terms of lining up the allies, particularly in Indo-Pacific, starting from Japan and South Korea, and the Philippines, and of course Australia and New Zealand, and to a certain extent other ASEAN countries. And of course the better substantive relationship with Taiwan also add up to the strong alliance in this space. Let me just, Ralph, get back a little bit to what you just talked to about the evacuation. I think any country has in place an evacuation plan and put it in the drawer just in case it's a contingency plan. I think what we're looking at is that whether that evacuation plan, if any, is coming to a realization that in a more sensible way and in a more imminent need to do that. At this moment, we don't see that. But overly emphasizing the fact that any country will have a contingency plan as an evacuation, I would say it's an over exaggeration.
So what are these reports out for? What's the purpose of releasing these so-called fake reports?
No, I think in a time like this, there has been the reports here and there, rumors or news here and there. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's 100% a fake news or misinformation, but I would say that it could be perceived to be an exaggeration of what has been there pre-existing on the pre-existing basis. That if you put it out and to say that in an exaggerating way that there is to say that there is an evacuation plan and put it in a drawer as a contingency is one thing. To say that somebody is trying to execute because there is an imminent need, the evacuation plan is a totally different thing. So I would say the latter is more of an exaggeration than a fact.
So if we turn the focus to the Pacific Islands or even for South China Sea, Charles, what would you say the battlefields in between China and the U.S. would be harder or stronger?
About South China Sea, I can say it's about territorial issues.
Right.
And every time when we study territorial issues, territory doesn't mean only the economic activities. We call the salience values.
Right.
Also, some in salience value is the meaning of territory, which means is we call the nationalism, and also we call the rally around the flag effects. Because both democracies and non-democratic countries, the leaders, they cannot bear any kind of, we say, losing territories.
Right. Sometimes it's more clear, right? If we talk about territory or nationalism.
There's some link between the territory and nationalism, for sure. Like what I say, if democratic leaders, they dare to lose any territories, they will lose the elections, for sure.
Right.
Autocracies, they even cannot lose any piece of territory because they probably will experience military coups or even they'll be chopped off heads. So I think China, for them, South China Sea, why they say they will not lose any dot, right? Because they view South China Sea as their traditional, the historical territories. If they lose any piece of South China Sea, people will doubt whether you can lose Taiwan or Xinjiang in the future.
It's interesting you mentioned that because Vietnam is also an authoritarian communist regime. Do you feel it operates in the same way? And given how it's courting between the U.S. and China?
Vietnam is an interesting case because we know that the top authorities is very close to China. They both we call the CCP, right? The Communist Party. But the Vietnam citizens, they have some love and hate against Chinese people. At least, they had war before between China and Vietnam.
Do you feel like Blinken, with his attempt to elevate ties between the two countries, will work in the end because they see a common adversary in China?
Like I say, Vietnam's play two hands cards. They also hedge. They have issues on territory against Beijing. However, they still need economic engagement with Beijing too. American people, they know that. They know those ASEAN countries, especially Vietnam and Philippines, they are kind of hedged. So right now, I think Blinken, they also want to use Vietnam as at least a card, one of the cards, to try to intervene the South China Sea issues. They want to bring Vietnamese and also Philippines back to the we call negotiation table against China. They also want the South China Sea as a bargaining chip, at least to postpone Chinese expansionism. So like what I say, if you were the leaders of South Asian countries, you probably need to be very, very careful about how to use South China Sea as a bargaining chips against Beijing.
In terms of winning allies, Stephen, do you feel that they're pivoting more towards the U.S. at this point?
Yes, in Indo-Pacific for the past 2 years. I think there has been some change in dynamics for the past 2 years. I think simply because of the fact that China is exerting and expanding its power over the places, both in terms of military and political, and of course economic inferences, and it has posed a certain degree of threat and insecurity, to many countries, including South Asian countries. Philippines to be one, and Vietnam's, which is another one. And I think the South China Sea issue it goes beyond the territorial issues or dispute. I think it's really the how China is positioning itself going forward, and whether or not and to what extent it poses real threat in countries in this region. And I think the United States is being, I think Biden administration has been made it very clear in the beginning of his first term right now that engaging in allying with the like-minded countries and the allies, in particularly in this region, is one of the most important things for the diplomacy and the foreign policy during his first term. And that so far, we've seen the real progress. And then it seems to be that it's more at this moment leaning towards the United States because of the successful diplomacy for the past 2.5 years.
So you don't see Cuba actually changing things in any way?
I don't think there
China
is
going into the U.S. backyard.
No, I don't. I think it's a pre-existing fact. I don't think it has been escalated, and I don't think there is anything new.
Right.
And I agree that there is no comparison between what's going on, what happened right now, on one hand, and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis on the other. What's for real is, as I just pointed out earlier, that it's China's influence is in the backyard of the United States, in Latin American countries, and that has posed a real threat, to the United States, and that has been in the process of being taken care of, primarily raising the eyebrows of Washington and also, and the people in the United States. So I think I would consider this as part of the U.S. Strategic competition with China. But once again, I don't think it will derail the ongoing constructive, hopefully, communications between the United States and China.
And also nothing for Taiwan to worry at this point.
I don't think so. I think reassuring from both sides the maintenance of the status quo, which is the peace and stability of Taiwan Strait, and no party will unilaterally change the status quo without the consent of the other side. And I think that assurance and reassurance from both sides is to the best interest of the stakeholders, including us, Taiwan, here.
Okay, so we see it on the political side, and moving on to trade, we want to talk about it. So JFK banned all bilateral trade with Cuba in February 1962. So this embargo lasted 6 years and severely hammered the Cuban economy. So Stephen, we're also curious, with this new planned spy facility, although we mentioned that it's nothing new, it's already there, and the whole world knew about it. So Biden administration, will they actually keep relaxing sanctions as he talked about it before against the Cuba, in your opinion?
Well, I think Biden administration, in the beginning of President Biden's first term, he openly mentioned about the revisit,
to get closer
relaxing
to Cuba.
the economic sanctions. There has been some resistance in many constituents, including certain Cuban American communities in Florida, but not just Florida, but in the United States.
Such as Senator Marco Rubio.
Exactly. Right. So Senator Marco Rubio is one of the strongest advocates against that. So now you see the news, breaking out on the spy facilities in Cuba and all that. Whether or not that will slow down the process of relaxing the economic sanctions on Cuba, that remains to be seen. And I do see a realistic possibility of either slowing down the process or narrowing the scope of the Cuba economic sanctions that we talked about, or that Biden administration mentioned early on. But we'll see how that develops. But I think the critical or the more important issue here is that how the United States continue to manage its diplomatic and other relationship with Latin American countries, and both in terms of the economic relationship, but also the strategic relationship, facing the threat from China. So I think the relationship with Cuba, or whether or not and to what extent lax the economic sanctions on Cuba, should be perceived to be part of the overall strategies where the U.S. diplomacy in that space.
Right. So we actually just seen that Honduras opened their embassy in China. So Stephen, we're curious, is this a slap in the face to the U.S., to Taiwan, or actually this is so normal because they are leaning to the economy superpower in the back, as China promises?
Well, I think the underlying reasons, if I understand correctly, of Honduras going back to China is more of economic.
Yes.
Because the deteriorating economic situation in Honduras. Now, I think both the United States and Taiwan have made tremendous efforts in upholding the diplomatic relationship between Honduras and Taiwan, but now Honduras is now, back with China. But we'll see how that goes, because it's a long-lasting battle. Whether or not the Honduran economy will be better because resuming the diplomatic relationship with China, or it will continue to deteriorate, and where there's a regime change.
Yes.
That's more domestic political issues in Honduras. But I think if you look at this in the overall pictures, and not just in Honduras, but in other Latin American countries similarly situated, it's more of a diplomacy and international relationship, but more underlying is the economic situations of
Right.
those countries.
Because China made a huge promise, but they didn't keep it.
Well, yeah, that's where the problem is. So it will take time to see, in a year or 2 years or longer, whether the economic situation of Honduras and other countries in Latin America will continue to be like that,
Right.
and whether there's some regime change or there's some change in diplomacy of those countries. And I think that is both economic and also strategic and also geopolitical. But we'll see how it goes in the next few years.
Steve, it's great how you mentioned economics, and the reason for the switch was because of that. Charles, Honduran President Castro, when she was in Beijing, she also signed for Honduras to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you feel this is a debt trap for the country, given that we've already seen news that seafood exporters are in trouble because
Like
Chinese
dropping and
they're
everything,
dropping
right.
because they're not paying the same price as what Taiwan used to pay?
Interesting questions. Let's go back to the very beginning of the Honduras issues when Castro switched side to Beijing. Actually, before Castro got elected as president, she agreed to the people in the country, if your household water and electricity bill is under 120 degrees, she will pay for you. So where the power come from, where the electricity come from, they need to build the power plants. So this is how Castro, when she tried to catch his, her
Catch the eyeballs
from the
right?
people and constituents. She said when she got elected, she will switch the side to China. Actually, China met their commitments. They are not only helping Castro, Honduras government, to build the water dam, they also send the people, Chinese team, to build the water dam. Why? If we study China's, we call the foreign aid, okay? China's foreign aid has two important characteristics. First thing we call ODA. ODA is official development assistance, which is when China give this one, like grants, like donations, they are very generous. They just want you to admit there's one China principle. If you say one China principle, fine, they will give you the
Which
grant.
is not the one China policy, the one China
One
principle.
China principle from Beijing, okay? And if you agree with the one China, they give you for free. However, there's another we call the foreign aid, we call the OOF, it's other official flows, is we call is loans, low interest loans, or other kind of types of loans or investments. This, when China give to the recipient countries, they want something. They want business effects. They want money back. So like what I say, this time when China and Honduras make some agreements, there's something a lot of related to OOF, especially the water dams, the power plants. Is Chinese government try to what? They will get the revenue back. So this is that trap for sure.
So this is the second phase of support for Honduras.
Yes.
And
So
they're setting
Honduras-
up that debt trap. as
all
we-
the Latin American recipients, African recipients, they know the effects of China's OOF. They will owe a lot of debts to China. They will need to pay. However, if you look at Honduras, they are democratic countries, which means they will experience regime change. If Castro cannot get elected next time, the new president, they need to pay the loans in the future.
And
So
Charles
if they
mentioned,
if they cannot pay the loans, they will become a debt trap for sure.
and Charles mentioned a very important point is that China bring their own team, their engineers, but not the local.
No, yeah. Right now they change all these kind of patterns when they try to help you to build infrastructures.
Yeah, that happens in Africa and other Latin
everywhere.
America countries.
Okay, you look a lot of infrastructure in Africa, build a railroad, highway, water dam, harbors.
Yeah.
They send a whole team from mainland China to help them to build. Do you think it's free? No, it's not free. You need to pay it back.
So Stephen, do you think there'll still be backlash as we've seen with the Malaita province and the Solomon Islands? Do you feel, say, fast forward a few years, Honduras could see the same thing, asking perhaps to have some channel with Taiwan?
Well, I think Charles has mentioned very clearly that this is that trap, but I think the Latin American countries like Honduras, they probably have very minimum options at this moment. But then, of course, Rafi mentioned whether there's a backlash. I don't know. Maybe in a few years, maybe domestic politics, in those countries will take on its own course. That is just Charles correctly mentioned. If the various countries would not be able to pay back the debt, whether there's an extension, whether there's other form of diplomacy with China and those countries, or whether domestically, people will vote on the other side, whether there's some, dancing around between China and the United States, we'll see. But I think it won't last for long.
Right.
I would have to say that to the minimum that this is what's going on right now, but if you take it in the long-term horizon, let's say 5 to 10 years, it's going to be a huge change.
But the elephant in the room is actually, do these countries really matter to Taiwan? Do you feel that Taiwan needs Honduras? Or do you feel Taiwan should focus on other countries that matter?
Well, I think we need to make our best efforts to continue to keep the diplomatic ties with those countries, and even possibly, expand, the countries with the number of countries where we have the diplomatic relationship with. But I do agree that what's even as important, or even more important, is to continue to build up a very strong ties, with all the countries in the whole world, particularly the like-minded countries, and those where we not just have a close trade and investment and economic relationship with, but also share the same values on rule of law, diplomacy, and rule of law, and democracy, and the rule-based economy. And I think not just for the Taiwan's diplomatic relationship, but for our own existence, it makes more sense to continue to build up the substantive relationship with all the like-minded countries in the world.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Charles.
If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel.
Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.